I was lying on the cold grocery store floor, my vision blurring as strangers gathered around me when I heard my son David's panicked voice cutting through the crowd. The medical bills I'd hidden for months were scattered from my purse like fallen leaves, and I watched his face transform from confusion to horror as he picked up the oncology invoices. 3 days earlier, he'd spent more on his mother-in-law's Mother's Day cruise than I'd spent on groceries in 6 months. My name is Margaret Williams, and I'm 67 years old. 3 days before my life exploded in aisle 7 of Murphy's Grocery, I was sitting in my small apartment, holding $12 worth of wilted supermarket flowers, listening to my son David through the thin walls of his study next door during his Sunday visit. He thought I couldn't hear him on the phone with his wife Claire, but these old apartment walls might as well be paper. Patricia absolutely loved the cruise surprise, David was saying, his voice bright with pride. $6,000 was totally worth it to see her face light up when she opened that envelope. Your mom deserves the best for Mother's Day. $6,000. I stared at my drooping carnations and did the math automatically, the way retired elementary school teachers do. That money could cover my groceries for an entire year. Maybe longer if I stuck to the generic brands like I'd been doing. The weird part is, I felt happy for Patricia in that moment. David's mother-in-law was getting a European cruise, and good for her. Really, she'd raised a lovely daughter who made my son smile in ways I hadn't seen since he was 8 years old, before his father decided our little family wasn't worth sticking around for. But here's what David didn't know as he bragged about his generosity to someone else's mother. Those wilted flowers sitting in my kitchen represented a choice between eating lunch that week or having something pretty to look at on Mother's Day. I chose pretty. Makes sense, right? Well, not exactly sense. More like the stubborn pride that kept me from telling him about the medical bills stacked in my bedroom drawer, like a paper mountain of secrets. 4 months earlier, Dr. Peterson had used words like stage 3 and aggressive treatment plan, while I calculated whether I could afford both chemotherapy and electricity that month. Spoiler alert, I couldn't. The darkness became my companion on more nights than I cared to admit. Sitting at my kitchen table, taking pills that cost more per dose than I used to spend on weekly groceries. I'd sold my house to pay for David's medical school, emptied my retirement accounts for his living expenses during residency, worked double shifts at the school cafeteria until I was 62 because he needed help with student loans. Every sacrifice felt like an investment in his future happiness, and the investment had paid off beautifully. David was now Dr. David Williams, transitioning from residency to private practice, married to Claire from one of those families where money flows like water and $6,000 gifts are casual Tuesday decisions. The only problem was that investors sometimes get left behind when their investments mature. Let's not forget the delicious irony here. While I was rationing my cancer medication to make it last longer, David was posting Instagram photos of Patricia's elaborate Mother's Day dinner at Chez Laurent, where the appetizers cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I double-tapped the photo from my dark apartment, genuinely happy to see him surrounded by abundance, even as I chewed generic crackers for dinner. But why didn't I just tell him? Pride, mostly. The same pride that made me work 3 jobs to keep him in clean clothes when other kids made fun of his secondhand sneakers. I'd built his new life on the foundation of my sacrifices, and I'd be damned if I'd let him see the cracks in that foundation now. Besides, he seemed almost embarrassed by our humble beginnings when Claire was around. I caught him once describing his childhood as challenging to her parents, as if my love and determination had somehow been obstacles instead of his launching pad. Then there were the canceled Sunday dinners, the shortened phone calls, the way he checked his watch when he visited like he had somewhere more important to be, and the terrible realization that maybe he did. 3 days after those wilted flowers, everything hidden would scatter across a grocery store floor like fallen secrets, impossible to gather back up. The funny thing about secrets is how much energy they take to maintain. Every phone call with David became a performance where I played the role of mom who's doing just fine. Oscar-worthy stuff, really. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he'd ask during our increasingly brief conversations. "Oh, you know me, tough as nails," I'd chirp, while secretly calculating whether I could afford both my blood pressure medication and the electric bill that month. Turns out, being tough as nails doesn't help much when you're choosing between chemotherapy and keeping the lights on. David started canceling our traditional Sunday dinners around this time. First, it was Claire's family barbecue, then Patricia's birthday celebration, then some charity gala where they needed to make an appearance for his practice. Rain check, Mom, became his favorite phrase. I collected those rain checks like coupons I'd never use. When he did visit, something had shifted. David carried himself differently now, spoke with this careful pronunciation that smoothed out the rough edges of our neighborhood accent. He wore clothes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget and checked his phone like he was expecting important news from important people. During one particularly awkward visit, Claire came along. Sweet girl, don't get me wrong. But I watched her survey my tiny apartment with the kind of polite smile people use when they're trying not to stare at a car accident. Her designer purse probably cost more than my rent. Your mom's place is so cozy, she told David later, thinking I couldn't hear from the kitchen. Cozy, the rich person's word for small and sad. That's when I started noticing how David talked about our past. Difficult upbringing was his favorite euphemism, like those nights I worked double shifts at the cafeteria and came home to help him with algebra homework were some kind of trauma instead of love in action. He never mentioned how I sold my mother's china set to buy his MCAT prep books, or pawned my wedding ring to cover his first semester textbooks. Those details didn't fit the narrative he was building for his new life. But here's the thing that really got to me. David started treating my sacrifices like embarrassments instead of investments. When Patricia's friends asked about his family at dinner parties, he'd deflect with vague mentions of being self-made, as if he'd materialize fully formed without a mother who chose his future over her own comfort for decades. Meanwhile, my medical bills kept arriving with the reliability of sunrise. Dr. Peterson's office sent them in cheerful envelopes, like they were party invitations instead of financial death sentences. Stage 3 cancer, turns out, is expensive. Who knew? The chemotherapy alone cost $3,000 per session. Insurance covered some of it, but some is a cruel word when you're living on a retired teacher's pension. I did the math obsessively. Groceries or treatment, electricity or medication, heat or hope. I chose hope every time, which meant I got very familiar with sitting in the dark. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort. It was becoming invisible in my own son's life, while watching him bend over backwards for people who'd never sacrificed anything for him. Patricia mentioned wanting new kitchen cabinets, and David hired contractors the next week. $15,000 just like that. That same week, I ate peanut butter sandwiches for 4 days straight because I'd spent my grocery money on anti-nausea medication. Then there was the night I overheard David on the phone with Claire, complaining about having to visit me on Sundays. She just seems so needy lately, he said. Always asking how I'm doing, wanting to talk. Patricia never guilt trips you like that. Needy? For wanting to spend time with the son I'd raised alone after his father decided we weren't worth the effort. I stopped asking how he was doing after that. Stopped suggesting Sunday dinners. Stopped being needy. My world got smaller and quieter. I quit my book club because I couldn't afford the monthly selections. Stopped going to church because I was embarrassed about wearing the same dress every week. Gave up my weekly coffee with Eleanor from next door because $3 for a latte was $3 I needed for medication. The isolation was almost worse than the cancer. Almost. While I was shrinking into shadows, David was expanding into this bright, successful life filled with expensive dinners and weekend getaways and social obligations that never included his mother. His Instagram feed became my window into a world where money flowed like water and problems got solved with credit cards. Claire's parents took them to Napa Valley for a long weekend. Cost more than I'd spent on anything in 2 years. David posted photos of wine tastings and 5-star restaurants, looking happier than I'd seen him since childhood. I double-tapped every photo from my dark apartment, genuinely glad he was happy, even if his happiness seemed to require my absence. But pride has a way of eating you alive from the inside. The same pride that kept me working 3 jobs when David was little now prevented me from reaching out when I needed help most. I'd built his success on the foundation of my sacrifices, and I couldn't bear the thought of him seeing those foundations cracking. The medical bills kept coming. My savings evaporated. I sold everything valuable I owned, including my mother's wedding ring. The pawn shop owner gave me $200 for a ring that had witnessed 60 years of marriage. I used the money for groceries and cried in the parking lot like a child. David never noticed the ring was gone. Why would he? He hadn't looked closely enough at me in months to notice I'd lost 30 pounds, or that my hands shook when I poured coffee, or that I wore the same 3 outfits in rotation because I'd sold everything else. 3 days before my world exploded in Murphy's grocery, I made a decision that felt both desperate and logical. I would stop hiding and start living, even if living meant admitting I couldn't afford to anymore. I put on my best remaining dress, applied lipstick with shaking hands, and walked 6 blocks to the grocery store to buy ingredients for a real meal. Something David might actually want to come over and share, if I could convince him I was worth an hour of his valuable time. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was going shopping with money I needed for medication, trying to buy back a relationship I'd apparently priced myself out of. What I didn't expect was that sometimes the truth has its own timeline, and secrets have a way of spilling out exactly when you're least prepared to explain them. The grocery store felt like enemy territory that Tuesday morning. My reflection in the automatic doors looked like a ghost wearing my clothes. 30 pounds lighter, hands trembling, but still pretending everything was fine. Old habits die hard, even when you're dying harder. I grabbed a cart and started my careful dance through the aisles. Generic mac and cheese, 59 cents. Store-brand soup, 73 cents. Every item went through my mental calculator before it touched the cart. David's last Instagram post showed him at some steakhouse where appetizers cost more than my weekly food budget. Funny how life works out sometimes. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was shopping with medication money, trying to afford ingredients for a dinner I'd probably eat alone. But hope makes you do stupid things. I kept thinking maybe if I cooked his favorite pot roast, David might actually stay for a whole conversation instead of checking his phone every 30 seconds. Aisle by aisle, I built my pathetic little fantasy. Candles on the table, the good plates I hadn't used in months, maybe even wine if I could stretch the budget. Like I could purchase back 18 months of canceled dinners with a $20 grocery haul. Then the dizziness hit. Not the gentle kind that whispers warnings, the kind that grabs you by the throat and says, "We're done pretending today." I'd skipped my morning pills to save money. Brilliant decision-making from someone who used to teach third graders about consequences. I was reaching for something on the top shelf when my knees decided they'd had enough of this whole staying upright charade. The world tilted sideways like a broken carnival ride. The fall felt endless and instant at the same time. Cold linoleum against my cheek. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps. Voices floating above me, but they sounded underwater. Someone was calling 911. Someone else was trying to see if I was breathing. But here's the thing about secrets. They don't stay secret when you're unconscious on a grocery store floor. My purse had exploded like a bomb filled with shame. Medical bills scattered everywhere. Prescription bottles rolling under shelves. Overdue notices floating like confetti celebrating my failure. And right there, face up for everyone to see, the pawn shop receipt for my mother's wedding ring. $200 for 60 years of marriage. The math looked even more pathetic written on yellow carbon paper. That's when I heard David's voice cutting through the crowd like a knife through my carefully constructed lies. Someone had called him from my emergency contact card. Dr. David Williams, rushing to save his mother. Except he was about to discover his mother had been dying quietly for months, while he played happy family with people who'd never sacrificed a damn thing for him. I couldn't open my eyes, but I could feel him kneeling beside me. Could hear his breathing change as he started picking up the pieces of my hidden world. The oncology bills with dates going back 4 months. The electricity shut-off notice. The grocery receipts showing how little I'd been eating. "Mom?" His voice cracked like it hadn't since he was 8 years old. But the worst part, the part that broke my heart even while I was lying there half-conscious, was hearing him cry. Real tears, not the polite sadness he'd learned to perform at charity galas. Raw, ugly crying that comes from realizing you've been living in a lie. He found the pawn receipt last. I heard him suck in his breath when he read it. My mother's ring, the one he'd admired as a child, sold for grocery money while he was buying his mother-in-law a European cruise. The paramedics arrived, but David was the one holding my hand as they loaded me into the ambulance. For the first time in months, I had his complete attention. Sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to discover who's willing to dig you out. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and regret. David hadn't left my bedside for 3 days straight, which was more time than we'd spent together in the past year. Funny how a medical emergency can suddenly clear someone's social calendar. He'd called in sick to his practice, canceled dinner with Patricia, ignored 17 text messages from Claire about some charity auction. The scattered grocery store evidence sat in a manila envelope on my bedside table, like exhibits in a trial nobody wanted to attend. "Why didn't you tell me?" he kept asking. "Because you were too busy playing rich boy to notice," I wanted to say. But pride works both ways. Even dying mothers have some left. "You had your own life to live," I said instead. He laughed, but it wasn't funny. Some life, spending more on strangers than on the woman who gave me everything. David had done the math. Patricia's cruise, her birthday party, the wine country weekend. $43,000 in 6 months on people who'd never missed a meal for him. Meanwhile, his actual mother was rationing cancer medication like Halloween candy. The worst part? He'd figured out I sold my mother's ring. The pawn shop receipt had his full attention for about 20 minutes while I pretended to sleep. When I finally opened my eyes, he was holding it like evidence of his own failure. "Grandma's ring bought your textbooks once too," I reminded him. "That was different. I was a kid." "No, you were my son, same as now." Here's what changed everything. David didn't make excuses or promise to do better next time. He moved back home, not visiting, living, sleeping in his old bedroom with the baseball posters still taped to the walls. He transferred his practice to take my insurance, canceled his country club membership, sold the fancy car Claire's parents had given him as a wedding gift. Claire filed for divorce within a month. Turns out love has income requirements in some circles. But you know what? David seemed relieved. Like he'd been holding his breath for 2 years, trying to be someone else's version of successful. We eat dinner together every night now. Real conversations about books and politics, and whether the neighbor's cat is plotting world domination. He laughs at my terrible jokes again. The cancer's responding to treatment. Turns out hope works better when you can afford the medication that goes with it. Sometimes the best gifts cost nothing. Sometimes they cost everything. David finally learned the difference, and sometimes love means coming home.